the moment I saw Deborah standing in my driveway with her clipboard. I knew my peaceful Tuesday afternoon was about to turn into a bureaucratic nightmare. I had just gotten home from work, still wearing my construction boots and dusty jeans from the job site in Clearwater, Florida, where I had spent the last 8 hours installing drywall in a new commercial building. My name is Vance, and I had been living in the Sunset Meadows community for exactly 3 years. 3 years of dealing with an HOA that seemed to make their decisions based on spite rather than logic. "Mr. Vance," Deborah called out, her voice that particular pitch that middle-aged women use when they are about to ruin your day. "I need to speak with you about a violation." I set down my lunch box on the hood of my truck and walked toward her. Deborah Patterson was the head of our HOA board, a woman in her mid-50s with blonde hair that was always styled in that soccer mom cut, complete with highlights that probably cost more than my monthly water bill. She wore capris and a floral blouse that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," energy. "What is it this time?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. The last violation had been about my mailbox being 2 inches shorter than regulation height. Before that, it was about leaving my trash cans visible from the street for an extra hour after pickup. "Your propane tank," she said, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "It is too close to your house." According to Section 12, Paragraph 4 of our community guidelines, all propane tanks must be positioned at least 10 feet from any structure. I turned to look at my propane tank. It was a standard 120-gallon tank that I used for my grill and outdoor heater. The tank sat against the side of my house, near my patio area. I had installed it there 2 years ago, and this was the first time anyone had said anything about it. "How close is it?" I asked. Deborah pulled out a measuring tape with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting their entire life for this moment. She stretched it from my house to the tank, making a show of being precise. 9 feet and 11 inches. That is 1 inch too close, Mr. Vance." I stared at her. 1 inch. 1 inch is still a violation, she said, making a note on her clipboard. "You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance, or you will face a fine of $200 per day until the issue is resolved." "You cannot be serious," I said. "It has been here for 2 years." "We are doing a thorough review of all properties," Deborah said. "Just because something went unnoticed does not mean it is not a violation. The rules exist for everyone's safety and to maintain our property values." I took a deep breath. "So you want me to move a 120-gallon propane tank that is bolted into a concrete pad?" "I want you to follow the community guidelines that you agreed to when you purchased your home," Deborah said. "This is not personal, Mr. Vance. This is about maintaining standards." She walked away before I could respond, her sandals clicking against my driveway pavement. I stood there, feeling the Florida heat pressing down on me, and considered my options. I could hire someone to move the tank properly, which would cost me at least $500 between the labor and creating a new concrete pad. I could fight it, which would mean going to HOA meetings and probably losing anyway. Or I could get creative. That evening, I sat on my patio with a beer and really looked at my propane tank. The concrete pad it sat on was about 3 feet by 3 feet. The tank itself was secured with 2 metal straps. The whole setup was stable and safe. The only problem was that imaginary line that said it needed to be 1 more inch away from my house. My neighbor, Tom, wandered over from his yard. Tom Richardson was a retired engineer who had lived in Sunset Meadows since the development was built 15 years ago. He was one of the few people in the neighborhood who thought the HOA was as ridiculous as I did. "I heard Deborah paid you a visit," he said, accepting the beer I offered him. Propane tank violation, I said. 1 inch too close. Tom laughed, but it was not a happy sound. They got me last year for having the wrong shade of white on my fence. Did you know there are 47 different shades of white? According to Deborah, I had used eggshell when I should have used ivory. Cost me $800 to repaint. That is insane, I said. That is Deborah Patterson, Tom replied. She has been HOA president for 7 years now. Nobody runs against her because nobody else wants the job, and she knows it. She treats this place like her personal kingdom. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. Then an idea hit me. Tom, I said slowly, the rule says the tank has to be 10 feet from the structure, right? That is what you said. So if I move it exactly 1 inch, technically I would be in compliance. Tom looked at me, then at the tank, then back at me. A grin spread across his weathered face. You are going to maliciously comply. I am going to follow the rules exactly as written, I said. The next day was Wednesday, and I took a half day off work. I went to the hardware store and bought a hydraulic jack, some wooden blocks, and a measuring tape that was even more precise than the one Deborah had used. Then I went home and got to work. Moving a propane tank 1 inch is not as simple as it sounds. The tank was heavy, easily 200 pounds even though it was only half full. The concrete pad was solid and level, but I was determined. I used the hydraulic jack to lift one side of the tank slightly, just enough to slide a wooden block underneath. Then I did the same on the other side. Slowly, carefully, I inched the tank away from the house. It took me 3 hours. 3 hours in the Florida sun, sweating through my shirt, adjusting and readjusting. Finally, I measured. 10 feet exactly from my house to the center of the propane tank. I measured 5 more times from different angles just to be sure. Perfect. I called the HOA office and left a message. This is Lucas Vance at 847 Meadowbrook Lane. I have corrected the propane tank violation. The tank is now in compliance with Section 12, Paragraph 4. Thank you. I thought that would be the end of it. I was so very wrong. 3 days later, on Saturday morning, Deborah was back in my driveway. This time she had brought reinforcements. 2 other HOA board members stood behind her, Patricia Chen and Margaret Sullivan. Patricia was the secretary, a thin woman in her 40s who always looked like she had somewhere more important to be. Margaret was the treasurer, slightly younger than Deborah, but with the same energy of someone who enjoyed wielding small amounts of power over others. Mr. Vance, Deborah said. Her face was red and not from the sun. Are you mocking this board? I had been washing my truck. I turned off the hose and walked over to them. No, I fixed the violation. You moved it 1 inch, Deborah said. Each word came out like a bullet. I moved it to exactly 10 feet from my house, as required by the guidelines, I said. Would you like to measure? This is unacceptable, Patricia said. You are clearly trying to undermine the authority of this board. I am clearly trying to follow the rules, I said. The rules said 10 feet. My tank is now 10 feet away. I do not see the problem. Margaret stepped forward. She had a folder in her hands. Mr. Vance, I want to remind you that the HOA board has the authority to levy fines and penalties for behavior that is disruptive to the community. What behavior? I asked. I fixed a violation. I did exactly what was asked of me. You know exactly what you did, Deborah said. And this board will not tolerate this kind of disrespect. Consider this a formal warning. A warning about what? I asked. Warn me specifically what rule I am breaking right now. They could not answer that. After several seconds of uncomfortable silence, they turned and walked away, but I could hear them talking in angry whispers as they left. I had a feeling this was far from over. That afternoon, I decided to look more carefully at the HOA guidelines. I had received a copy when I bought the house, but like most people, I had never actually read through all 97 pages of rules. Now, I sat at my kitchen table with a highlighter and actually went through the document. What I found was fascinating. The guidelines were full of subjective language and contradictions. Yards had to be maintained appropriately, but there was no definition of what that meant. Houses had to be painted in approved colors, but the list of approved colors was not in the document. There were rules about noise, about parking, about landscaping, but most of them were vague enough that the HOA board could interpret them however they wanted. I also found something interesting in Section 31. There was a process for challenging HOA decisions. Any homeowner could request a formal review of an HOA action by submitting a written appeal. The board then had to hold a hearing within 30 days where the homeowner could present their case. If the homeowner was unsatisfied with that result, they could call for a vote of the general membership. I had never heard of anyone actually using this process, but there it was in the official guidelines that the board was so fond of citing. On Monday morning, I typed up a formal letter. I detailed the propane tank situation, including photos with measurements. I did not challenge the violation itself, because technically, I had been 1 inch off. Instead, I challenged the spirit of enforcement, pointing out that the tank had been in place for 2 years, that 1 inch made no practical difference in safety, and that the aggressive enforcement was inconsistent with how other violations were handled. I had noticed plenty of things in the neighborhood that were not up to code, from mailboxes at the wrong height to cars parked on lawns overnight to yards that were more weeds than grass. I submitted the appeal to the HOA management company that handled the day-to-day operations for Sunset Meadows. They were a company called Community First Management, based in Tampa. I also sent a copy directly to Deborah Patterson's home address, which was listed on the HOA documents. 2 weeks went by with no response. According to the guidelines, they had to respond within 14 days of receiving an appeal. On day 15, I sent a certified letter pointing this out. On day 17, I received a phone call. "Mr. Vance, this is Linda Monroe from Community First Management. I am calling about your appeal regarding the propane tank violation." Linda sounded tired, like she had this conversation 100 times before. I wondered how many homeowners in how many communities called her with similar complaints. "Thank you for getting back to me," I said. "I was starting to think you had lost my letter." "We received it," Linda said. "I have discussed it with the board at Sunset Meadows. They have agreed to hold a hearing this Thursday at 7 p.m. at the community center. You will have 15 minutes to present your case." 15 minutes, I repeated. "That is standard," Linda said. "The board will then make a decision on your appeal. Is there anything else? Will this meeting be open to other homeowners?" There was a pause. HOA meetings are supposed to be open to all residents, yes. But typically only board members and the appealing homeowner attend these hearings. "I understand," I said. "I will be there Thursday." I spent the next few days preparing. I put together a presentation with photos, measurements, and a timeline. I printed out copies of the relevant sections of the HOA guidelines. I also drove around the neighborhood with my phone camera and documented every violation I could find. There were quite a few. Thursday evening, I arrived at the community center at 6:45. The community center was a small building near the entrance of Sunset Meadows, with a meeting room that held about 50 people. When I walked in, the 5 board members were already seated at a long table at the front. Deborah Patterson, Patricia Chen, Margaret Sullivan, and 2 men I recognized but had never spoken to. One was Robert Fisher, the vice president, a balding man in his 60s who worked as an accountant. The other was James Walton, a member-at-large who owned a car dealership in Tampa. Linda Monroe sat to the side with her laptop, presumably taking notes. There were 3 other people in the audience, neighbors I recognized but did not know well. "Mr. Vance," Deborah said, "thank you for coming. Please take a seat. We will begin shortly." At exactly 7, Deborah called the meeting to order. She read through some standard opening procedures, then turned her attention to me. "We are here tonight to address an appeal filed by Lucas Vance regarding a violation notice for his propane tank placement. Mr. Vance, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I walked to the front of the room and set up my laptop, connecting it to the projector. "Thank you. As detailed in my written appeal, I received a violation notice on August 15th for my propane tank being 1 inch too close to my house. I corrected this violation within 48 hours. However, I am appealing the enforcement action for several reasons." I clicked to my first slide, which showed a photo of my propane tank in its original position. First, this tank was installed professionally 2 years ago. At no point during those 2 years did the HOA indicate any issue with its placement. The sudden enforcement of this violation for a 1-inch discrepancy suggests selective or arbitrary enforcement. Deborah started to speak, but I continued. "Second, the safety rationale for a 10-foot distance is to prevent fire hazards. A 1-inch difference does not materially change the safety profile of this installation. The tank is properly secured, properly vented, and regularly inspected." I clicked to the next slide, which showed a graph I had made. Third, and most importantly, the enforcement appears inconsistent with how other violations are handled in this community. The next several slides showed photos I had taken around the neighborhood. A house with gutters hanging loose, a property with grass nearly a foot tall, multiple mailboxes at incorrect heights, a boat parked in a driveway which was explicitly forbidden in the guidelines, a fence with several broken boards. "These are all violations of the HOA guidelines," I said. "Some have existed for months or years. Yet the board chose to issue a violation notice to me for being 1 inch out of compliance on a safety measure that poses no actual safety risk. This suggests that the enforcement is not about safety or community standards, but rather about selective targeting." Deborah's face was getting red again. "Mr. Vance, we cannot possibly monitor every single property every single day. Then perhaps the enforcement should focus on violations that actually impact the community," I said. "Not 1-inch measurement discrepancies on equipment that has been safely in place for years." I spent the rest of my 15 minutes walking through the specific guidelines and showing how the propane tank situation met the spirit of the rules even if it had technically been 1 inch off in the letter. I concluded by requesting that the violation be removed from my record and that the board establish clearer guidelines for enforcement priorities. When I finished, Deborah looked like she wanted to throw something. "Are you quite done?" "Yes, thank you for your time," I said. "The board will now deliberate," Deborah said. "Please wait outside." I went out into the hallway. One of the neighbors who had been watching followed me out. He was a younger guy, probably early 30s, with glasses and a friendly face. "That was impressive," he said, offering his hand. "I am David Morneau. I live over on Sunset Drive." "Lucas Vance," I said, shaking his hand. "Thanks." "I've had my own issues with the board," David said. "They tried to make me remove my solar panels last year, said they were not aesthetically pleasing. I had to get a lawyer involved. Cost me $3,000, but I won." "They can just make you do things like that?" I asked. "They try," David said. The problem is most people do not fight back. It is easier to just comply, even when the rules are ridiculous. So the board gets used to having total control. We talked for about 20 minutes before the door opened, and Linda Monroe called me back in. The 5 board members sat with identical stern expressions. Deborah spoke for the group. "Mr. Vance, the board has considered your appeal. We acknowledge that you corrected the violation in a timely manner. However, we maintain that the violation notice was appropriate based on the measurements taken. Your suggestion that enforcement is selective is unfounded and frankly insulting to the volunteer members of this board who work hard to maintain our community standards. Your appeal is denied. I had expected this, but it still frustrated me. So that is it, despite the evidence I presented." "That is our decision," Deborah said. "This matter is now closed, unless you have violated any other rules recently." The way she said it felt like a threat. I gathered my materials and left. Over the next week, I received 3 more violation notices. The first was for my trash cans being visible from the street. They had been in the same spot for 3 years, tucked beside my garage, barely visible from the road if you were really looking. The second was for having a lawn ornament that was not on the approved list. The ornament in question was a small metal turtle that sat in my garden bed. I had bought it at a craft fair 2 years ago. The third violation was for my house numbers being the wrong font. It was obviously retaliation, and it was not even subtle. I documented everything, took photos with timestamps, and started keeping a detailed log of every interaction with the HOA. I also started going to the monthly HOA meetings. These were held on the 3rd Wednesday of every month, also at the community center. Most months, only the board members and Linda Monroe attended. When I showed up to the September meeting, Deborah looked surprised. "Mr. Vance, homeowners are welcome at these meetings, but we typically do not have much that would interest residents." "I am interested in understanding how the board operates," I said pleasantly. "I will just observe." The meeting was exactly as boring as expected. They discussed the budget for landscaping, approved some paint colors for homeowners who had requested them, and reviewed the schedule for pool maintenance. But I noticed something interesting. When they voted on items, it was always unanimous. 5 votes every time, no discussion, no debate. After the meeting, I approached Robert Fisher, the vice president. He seemed less hostile than Deborah. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "How does the board usually make decisions?" Robert glanced toward Deborah, who was talking with Patricia. "Well, we discuss things and vote." "But the votes are always unanimous," I said. "Does anyone ever disagree?" Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Deborah usually has strong opinions about what is best for the community. The rest of us trust her judgment. She has been doing this a long time." Translation. Deborah ran the show and everyone else just went along with it. I started researching HOA law in Florida. It turned out there were quite a few statutes that governed how homeowners associations could operate. They were required to hold elections, to keep financial records available for homeowner review, to follow their own bylaws, and to act reasonably in enforcement. That last part was interesting. There was legal precedent in Florida that HOAs had to enforce rules reasonably and consistently. Selective enforcement could be challenged in court. I also learned about something called a recall election. If 20% of homeowners in a community signed a petition, they could force a recall vote for any board member. Sunset Meadows had 243 homes, which meant I would need at least 49 signatures. I decided to test the waters. I created a simple survey and started going door to door on weekends. The survey asked homeowners about their satisfaction with HOA management, whether they felt rules were enforced fairly, and whether they would be interested in attending a community meeting to discuss HOA issues. The response was eye-opening. Out of the first 50 homes I visited, I managed to speak with someone at 32 of them. Of those 32, 27 expressed frustration with the HOA. People shared stories about ridiculous violations, arbitrary rule changes, and feeling like they could not enjoy their own homes without constant oversight. Several people asked if I was organizing something because they would support it, but there was also fear. Multiple people told me they worried that if they spoke up, they would be targeted like I was being targeted. One woman, Teresa Lopez, who lived on my street, told me she had received 5 violation notices in 1 month after she questioned a budget item at a meeting 3 years ago. "They make your life hell if you challenge them," Teresa said. "It is easier to keep your head down." I understood the fear, but it also made me angry. This was supposed to be our community, not Deborah Patterson's personal fiefdom. By the end of October, I had been to nearly 100 homes. I had surveys from 68 homeowners, and the results were consistent. People were unhappy, but they felt powerless to change anything. I decided to organize a meeting. Not an official HOA meeting, but a gathering for homeowners to discuss issues with the association. I reserved space at a local restaurant's event room, sent out an email to everyone whose contact information I had collected, and posted flyers on the community bulletin board at the pool. Deborah noticed the flyers immediately. She called me that same evening. "What do you think you are doing?" She demanded. "I am exercising my right to talk with my neighbors," I said calmly. "You are attempting to undermine this board." "I am attempting to have a conversation about how our community is managed. That is not undermining anything. If you continue with this antagonistic behavior, the board will have no choice but to pursue legal action." "Legal action for what?" I asked. "What exactly am I doing that is illegal?" Deborah did not have an answer for that. She hung up. The meeting at the restaurant was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in early November. I did not know how many people would show up. I arrived early to set up, arranging chairs in a casual circle rather than the formal rows the HOA used at their meetings. By 2 o'clock, when the meeting was supposed to start, 43 people had shown up. By 2:15, there were 62. People kept coming until nearly 80 homeowners filled the room. I stood up and introduced myself, though many people already knew who I was. The propane tank story had apparently made the rounds. "Thank you all for coming," I said. "I want to start by being clear about what this is and what it is not. This is not an attempt to eliminate the HOA or to stop having community standards. This is about how those standards are enforced and who gets to make decisions about our neighborhood." I shared my own experiences with the propane tank and the subsequent retaliation violations. Then I opened the floor for others to share their stories. What followed was 2 hours of homeowners venting frustrations they had been holding in for years. A man named Richard described being fined $500 because his Christmas lights were up for 3 days, past the January 1st deadline. A young couple, Mark and Jennifer, talked about being denied permission to install a wheelchair ramp for Jennifer's mother because it would be visually inconsistent with the neighborhood aesthetic. An elderly woman named Helen shared that she had been cited for weeds in her yard when she was in the hospital recovering from surgery. The common thread was that Deborah and the board seemed more interested in control than in actually serving the community. "So what can we do?" someone asked. "They are the board. We elected them." "Did we?" I asked. "How many of you voted in the last HOA election?" A few hands went up, maybe 10 out of the 80 people present. "That is part of the problem," I said. "The last election had less than 15% turnout." Most of us do not even know when elections happen or who is running. Deborah has been president for 7 years because nobody runs against her. I did not even know we could run for the board, Teresa said. Not only can you run, but we can also recall current board members if enough homeowners sign a petition, I said. I explained the process I had discovered in my research. Would you run for president? Someone asked me. The question caught me off guard. I had not really thought about it. I am not trying to take over the HOA, I just want it to be run fairly. But someone has to run against Deborah, David Morneau pointed out. Otherwise, nothing changes. Maybe we should all run, someone else suggested. Get a whole new board. The energy in the room shifted. What had started as a venting session was turning into something more organized. By the end of the meeting, we had formed a committee of 8 people who agreed to work on 3 goals. Increase awareness about HOA elections, recruit candidates for the board, and document ongoing issues with enforcement for potential legal action if needed. I left that meeting feeling energized but also nervous. I had started something that was bigger than my propane tank. The next HOA board meeting was the following Wednesday. When I arrived at the community center at 6:45, I was surprised to see at least 30 other homeowners already there. The small meeting room was more crowded than it had probably ever been. Deborah looked like she had seen a ghost when she walked in at 6:55 and saw the crowd. She conferred quietly with the other board members, and I could see the concern on their faces. The meeting started awkwardly. Deborah went through the usual opening procedures, but her voice was tight. When she got to the public comment period, which was usually just a formality since nobody attended, 15 people had signed up to speak. One by one, homeowners stood up and expressed their concerns. They were polite but firm. They talked about wanting more transparency, more consistent enforcement, more communication about decisions that affected property values and daily life. Deborah tried to maintain control. We appreciate your feedback. The board will take these comments under advisement. When? Someone called out. When will you actually address these issues? These matters are complex, Patricia Chen said. The board needs time to review and discuss. You have had years, David Morneau said. How much more time do you need? The meeting devolved into a debate that lasted nearly 2 hours. Deborah eventually called for adjournment, cutting off several people who still wanted to speak. People were angry as they left. This is just the beginning, Teresa said to me as we walked out. We are not backing down. Over the next few weeks, tensions in Sunset Meadows escalated. The committee we had formed started meeting regularly at my house. We created a Facebook group for the neighborhood that quickly grew to over 100 members. We set up a website where homeowners could anonymously report HOA issues. The documentation we were collecting was extensive. Meanwhile, Deborah seemed to be doubling down. More violation notices went out to people who had attended the restaurant meeting or the crowded HOA meeting. It was clumsy retaliation, and it only made more people angry. In early December, I received a certified letter from an attorney. The law firm Davis and Associates, representing the Sunset Meadows HOA, accused me of harassment, defamation, and organizing activities that violated the community covenants. They demanded I cease all organizing activities and issued a formal warning that continued behavior could result in legal action. I took the letter to my own attorney, a recommendation from David, who had dealt with HOA issues before. Her name was Karen Williams, which she acknowledged with good humor was ironic given the stereotypes. Karen read through the letter carefully. "This is an intimidation tactic," she said. "Nothing you have described doing is illegal or even against the HOA covenants. They are trying to scare you into silence. Will it work?" I asked. Karen smiled. That depends on you, but if you want my professional opinion, they are scared. They would not be sending threatening letters if they felt secure in their position. The question is whether you want to keep pushing this. I thought about it. The propane tank issue seemed so small now, almost silly, but it had opened my eyes to a much bigger problem. There were hundreds of people in this community who felt bullied and powerless in their own homes. If I backed down now, nothing would change. I want to keep going, I said. Then let me send a response, Karen said. We will make it clear that you are exercising your legal rights and that any further threats will be met with appropriate action. Karen sent the letter within 2 days. I do not know exactly what it said, but I did not receive any more legal threats after that. The holidays were usually a relatively quiet time in the neighborhood, but not that year. The Facebook group stayed active with people posting photos of holiday violations they had received. Deborah apparently had very specific rules about Christmas decorations that most people had never heard of. You could not have inflatable decorations. Lights had to be white or warm white, not colored. Decorations had to be removed by January 1st or face immediate fines. Someone suggested we all put up inflatable decorations as a protest. The idea caught fire, and suddenly dozens of yards in Sunset Meadows sprouted inflatable Santas, snowmen, and reindeer. Driving through the neighborhood looked like a festival. Deborah went ballistic. She sent out a mass email citing the rules and threatening fines. But there were too many violations to realistically enforce. If she fined everyone, she would be fining half the neighborhood. In mid-January, the organizing committee met to discuss strategy for the upcoming election. HOA elections in Sunset Meadows were held in March, with nominations due by February 1st. We need a full slate of candidates, David said. President, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and 2 at-large members. If we only replace 1 or 2 people, Deborah will still control the board. Who wants to run? I asked, looking around the room. There was silence for a moment. Then Teresa spoke up. I will run for secretary. I am a paralegal, so I am good with documentation and procedures. I will do treasurer, said Mark Chen, no relation to Patricia. He was an accountant who had been vocal about wanting more financial transparency. Others volunteered for the other positions. Finally, everyone turned to look at me. Lucas, you have to run for president, Teresa said. You started this whole thing. People trust you. I hesitated. Running for HOA president was not something I had ever imagined doing, but I also knew Teresa was right. If I was not willing to step up, why should anyone else? Okay, I said. I will run. We spent the next 2 weeks preparing. We drafted platform statements focusing on fair and consistent enforcement, financial transparency, and better communication with homeowners. We created simple flyers and planned to hand-deliver them to every home in the community. On February 1st, we submitted our nomination papers to Linda Monroe at Community First Management. By the rules, nominations were open until February 10th, and the election would be held at a special meeting on March 15th. Deborah did not take the challenge well. She immediately sent out an email to all homeowners warning about radical elements trying to take over the HOA. She claimed that the current board had maintained property values and community standards for years, and that changing leadership would lead to chaos. She also started campaigning hard. She and the other current board members went door to door, held a meet and greet at her house, and sent out multiple emails highlighting their experience and dedication. What she did not anticipate was how many people were ready for change. Our slate of candidates did not have much money, but we had enthusiasm and volunteers. Nearly 50 homeowners helped with the campaign, delivering flyers, talking to neighbors, and spreading the word on social media. The election meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on March 15th at the community center. Because of fire code, the center could only hold 100 people. By 6:30, there were already 150 people trying to get in. Linda Monroe had to move the meeting to the clubhouse by the community pool, which had a bigger space. Even that was crowded. Nearly 200 homeowners showed up, an unheard-of turnout for an HOA election. The room buzzed with conversation and nervous energy. Linda called the meeting to order and explained the voting process. Each homeowner would receive a ballot with all the positions listed. You could vote for the current board members or the challengers. Simple majority won. Deborah gave a speech about her years of service and her commitment to maintaining Sunset Meadows as a premier community. She talked about property values, safety, and preserving the character of the neighborhood. She did not mention anything about the complaints people had raised. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. I am running because I believe an HOA should serve its residents, not control them. We all chose to live here because we wanted a nice, safe community. But that should not mean living in fear of petty violations and arbitrary enforcement. If elected, our team will focus on reasonable rules, consistent application, and respecting homeowners. Thank you. The applause was loud. Voting took about an hour as Linda collected and counted ballots. The room was tense as we waited for results. Finally, Linda stood up with a piece of paper. I have the results of the election, she said. For HOA president, Vance has received 127 votes. Deborah Patterson has received 68 votes. Vance is the new president. The room erupted in cheers. Linda continued reading the results. Our entire slate had won. Teresa was the new secretary. Mark was treasurer. David became vice president. 2 other members of our committee won the at-large positions. For the first time in 7 years, Sunset Meadows had a completely new HOA board. Deborah looked stunned. She gathered her things and left without speaking to anyone. Patricia and Margaret followed her out. Only Robert Fisher came over to congratulate us. I hope you folks know what you are getting into, he said, but he was smiling. Good luck. The transition period was supposed to last 30 days, during which the old board would hand over all documents, records, and access to accounts. It did not go smoothly. Deborah was supposed to provide copies of all HOA records, including financial statements, correspondence, violation records, and legal documents. She provided a single box of poorly organized papers and said that was everything. Where are the financial records from the last 7 years? Mark asked at the transition meeting. In there, Deborah said, pointing at the box. Mark went through it later. There were bank statements, but they were incomplete. There were expense receipts, but no organized ledger. There were contracts with vendors, but no documentation of how those vendors were selected or whether other bids were considered. This is a mess, Mark told me. I cannot even tell you how much money is in the HOA accounts right now without accessing the bank directly. We also discovered that Deborah had control of the HOA email account, the website password, the Facebook page that the HOA officially ran, and even the keys to the pool and clubhouse. She was not responding to requests to hand these over. After 2 weeks of getting nowhere, Karen Williams sent Deborah a formal legal letter demanding the turnover of all HOA property and access within 72 hours. Deborah's response was to lock us out of the bank accounts. She changed the authorized signers, Mark said. I called the bank to set up online access for the new treasurer, and they told me I am not listed as authorized. Deborah is still the only person with access. That was when things got serious. Karen filed an emergency motion in court to force the turnover of HOA assets. The judge was not pleased. At the hearing, Deborah's attorney tried to argue that there were concerns about financial irregularities and that Deborah was protecting the HOA's assets until a proper audit could be done. The judge was not buying it. The election results are clear. The new board has been lawfully elected. Miss Patterson has no legal authority to retain control of HOA assets. I am ordering the immediate turnover of all accounts, records, and property. If this is not completed within 48 hours, Miss Patterson will be held in contempt of court. That got Deborah's attention. Within 2 days, Mark received access to the bank accounts. Teresa got control of the email and records, and someone dropped off the keys to the pool and clubhouse at my house in an unmarked envelope. But when Mark finally got a full accounting of the finances, what he found was disturbing. "We need to talk," he said to me and the rest of the board. "In person, not over the phone." We met at my house that evening. Mark spread out printed bank statements across my dining room table. "Okay," he said. "So the HOA collects about $200,000 a year in dues from homeowners. That money is supposed to cover landscaping, pool maintenance, common area upkeep, insurance, and management fees. The budget Deborah presented at meetings every year showed expenses roughly matching income." "So what is the problem?" David asked. "The problem is the actual bank statements do not match the budgets," Mark said. "Over the last 3 years, about $120,000 is unaccounted for." We all stared at him. "What do you mean unaccounted for?" Teresa asked. "I mean there are withdrawals and transfers that are not documented in any expense reports. Some of it is checks made out to cash. Some is transfers to an account I cannot identify. And there are credit card charges to the HOA account for personal expenses." Mark showed us the statements. There were charges to restaurants, retail stores, even a vacation resort. Thousands of dollars in charges that had nothing to do with maintaining a homeowners association. "This is embezzlement," I said. "That is exactly what it is," Karen said. I had asked her to join us when Mark said it was urgent. "This is criminal fraud. You need to report this to the police." "Are we sure?" David asked. "I mean, could there be some explanation?" "I have been through every document Deborah provided," Mark said. "There is no legitimate explanation for these expenses. She was using HOA funds as her personal bank account." The next morning, I called the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with someone about financial fraud. They directed me to the Economic Crimes Unit. I met with a detective named Rodriguez that afternoon and provided copies of everything Mark had found. Detective Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s with short dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She reviewed the documents carefully. "How much are we talking about?" she asked. "At least $120,000 over 3 years, I said. "Possibly more if we go back further, but we only have complete records for the last 3 years. "And you are the new HOA president?" "As of 3 weeks ago, yes." "Okay, Mr. Vance. I am going to open an investigation. We will need to subpoena the bank records and interview Miss Patterson. This is going to take some time, but based on what you have shown me, there is definitely probable cause to investigate." "What should we do in the meantime?" I asked. "Continue documenting everything. Do not confront Miss Patterson about this. Let us handle the criminal investigation. You focus on getting your HOA back in order." Over the next few weeks, our new board worked to stabilize the community. We held a special meeting to explain the financial situation to homeowners. People were shocked and angry. Several wanted to immediately sue Deborah personally, but Karen advised us to let the criminal process play out first. We also started making changes to how the HOA operated. We established clear guidelines for enforcement that prioritized actual safety issues and community impact over minor technical violations. We created an appeals process that was actually functional. We started sending out monthly newsletters with financial updates and upcoming decisions. In April, we held our first regular monthly meeting as the new board. About 40 homeowners attended, which was still much higher than the old meetings but less than the packed elections. We discussed the budget, upcoming projects, and took questions. One homeowner asked about my propane tank, which got a laugh from the room. "It is still exactly 10 feet from my house," I said. "But I want everyone to know that under the new board, we are not going to be measuring your property with a ruler looking for 1-inch violations. If something is a legitimate safety issue, we will address it. Otherwise, we trust you to maintain your property responsibly." In June, Detective Rodriguez called me. "Mr. Vance, I wanted to give you an update. We have completed our investigation into Deborah Patterson. We have subpoenaed records from her personal bank accounts and credit cards. We can trace at least $97,000 from the HOA accounts directly to her personal use. We are going to be making an arrest." "When?" I asked. "Tomorrow morning." "I wanted to give you a heads up in case there is media attention. This is a significant amount of money, and it involves a position of trust in the community." The next morning, I watched from my living room window as 2 sheriff's deputies knocked on Deborah Patterson's door 3 houses down. She answered in her bathrobe. They talked for a few minutes, then she went back inside. She came out 10 minutes later, dressed, and was escorted to a patrol car. No handcuffs that I could see, but she was clearly under arrest. The local news picked up the story that evening. "Former HOA president arrested for embezzlement" was the headline on Channel 10. They interviewed Detective Rodriguez, who confirmed that Deborah Patterson had been arrested and charged with grand theft and fraud, both felonies. The news spread through Sunset Meadows immediately. The Facebook group exploded with comments. Some people felt vindicated. Some felt sorry for Deborah's family. Most were just glad that the investigation had confirmed what we suspected. Deborah made bail the next day. Her attorney released a statement denying the charges and claiming this was politically motivated by the new HOA board. That claim did not hold up well, since the charges were based on bank records, not accusations. The criminal case took months to move through the system. Deborah pleaded not guilty initially, but in August, her attorney negotiated a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to 1 count of grand theft, a third-degree felony. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation, ordered to repay the $97,000, and required to perform 500 hours of community service. She also faced a civil lawsuit from the HOA to recover additional funds and legal costs. By the time the case was resolved, life in Sunset Meadows had settled into a new normal. The HOA was running smoothly under the new board. We had repainted the community center, updated the pool equipment, and even added some new landscaping at the entrance. People were not afraid of violation notices anymore. Yards were still well maintained because people took pride in their homes, not because they feared arbitrary enforcement. The community felt friendlier, more relaxed. On a Saturday afternoon in September, I was working in my garage when Tom Richardson walked over. "Hey Lucas, you got a minute?" "Sure, what is up?" "I just wanted to say thanks," Tom said. "I know this whole thing started with your propane tank, and you could have just moved it and forgotten about it, but you stood up for the whole neighborhood. Things are a lot better now." "Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that." "I also wanted to mention," Tom said with a grin, "that I measured your propane tank the other day. It is exactly 10 feet and 1 inch from your house. I laughed. I might have adjusted it slightly. Might have moved it 1 inch back just to be safe, something like that. Tom shook his head, still smiling. You know, if you had just moved it a few feet in the first place, none of this would have happened. Probably not, I agreed. But then again, a lot of people were suffering under Deborah's management. Maybe the propane tank was just the excuse we needed to finally do something about it. True enough, Tom said. So are you going to run for president again next year? I have not decided yet, I said. Ask me again in January. Tom laughed and headed back to his house. I stood in my garage, looking out at my yard, at my propane tank sitting precisely where it needed to be. When Deborah had first told me to move that tank, I had felt annoyed and powerless. The whole situation had seemed petty and unfair. Moving it exactly 1 inch had been a small act of defiance, a way to follow the letter of the law while making a point about how ridiculous the enforcement was. I never expected that 1 inch would lead to all of this. An election, an investigation, criminal charges. A complete transformation of how our HOA operated. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can spark bigger changes. Not because the act itself is significant, but because it reveals problems that everyone knew existed, but nobody wanted to confront. The propane tank was still there, still functioning perfectly, still exactly the right distance from my house. It had not changed, but everything else had. That evening, I sat on my patio with a cold beer, watching the sunset. Teresa called to discuss agenda items for the next board meeting. David texted about organizing a community barbecue. Mark sent a message that the quarterly financial report was ready for review. These were the kinds of problems I did not mind having. These were the issues of a community working together, not fighting against each other. My phone buzzed with a notification from the neighborhood Facebook group. Someone had posted a photo of an inflatable Halloween decoration, jokingly asking if it violated any HOA rules. The comments were full of laughing emojis and jokes about measuring tapes. I smiled and took a sip of my beer. The Florida heat was finally breaking as fall approached. The air felt lighter somehow, or maybe that was just my imagination. Whatever battles might come in the future, whatever challenges the HOA might face, I knew one thing for certain. We would handle them together as a community with respect and reason, and my propane tank would remain exactly where it was. 10 feet from the house. Not 9 feet and 11 inches. Not 10 feet and 6 inches. Exactly 10 feet. Well, 10 feet and 1 inch if we were being precise. But who was measuring?